Hey, welcome back, my friend. Welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I am so glad you're here. Tonight we're going to talk about something that I genuinely could not stop thinking about for weeks after I first came across it. And it is one of those stories where the more you look at it, the stranger and more human it gets. Tonight we're asking a question that sounds almost too strange to be real. Why could a rich Victorian woman steal from a shop, walk right out of a department store with things she never paid for, and face almost no consequences, while a poor woman caught doing the exact same thing would be arrested, tried, and sent to prison? And here is the part that makes this story genuinely extraordinary. The thefts by wealthy women happened so frequently, so consistently across England and America, that at some point the doctors of the era sat down and created an entirely new medical diagnosis to explain it. A diagnosis that, by its very definition, could only ever apply to women who were already rich. Women who did not need what they were taking. Which brings us to the question I want you to sit with tonight as we begin. Why would a wealthy Victorian woman steal in the first place? She already had everything. A beautiful house, servants, a respectable husband. More gloves than she could ever wear. So why was she slipping card cases and ribbons and small silver objects into the lining of her muff and walking calmly out of the most elegant department stores in London? Why did this happen often enough that the stores had to hire plainclothes female detectives specifically to watch for it? Why did it happen often enough that courts across two countries started accepting a medical diagnosis as a defense against criminal charges? What was going on behind those composed, perfectly dressed, utterly respectable faces? That is what we're going to explore tonight. The daily life of a wealthy Victorian woman, the strange world of the Victorian department store, the very convenient diagnosis that protected rich women from the law, and the much harder question underneath all of it. The question about what a person does when their life has everything in it, except room to breathe. Before we go any further, if you are new here and tonight's story is working on you, if you are already leaning in a little, I would love it if you took just a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps Sleepy Old World reach more people who want to spend their evenings exactly like this, in the quiet company of history. And if you want to tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, drop it in the comments. I always love knowing. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights if you can, and let us go back to London, 1892. Not a dramatic morning. Not a morning anyone would later remember or write down. The sky is doing what London skies do in October, a low, grey, non-committal sort of light that cannot quite decide whether it intends to produce rain or simply threatens it indefinitely. The streets smell of coal smoke and horse and damp stone, that particular Victorian urban smell you would find either romantic or intolerable, depending on whether you'd been born into it. Vendors are calling from their carts along the main road. A newsboy has stationed himself on a corner near Regent Street and is shouting something, though at this distance his words dissolve into the general noise of the city waking up and beginning its business. Inside a townhouse on a quiet street not far from Mayfair, a woman named Charlotte is finishing her breakfast. She is 37 years old. Her husband is a solicitor, not wildly prosperous, but comfortably established. The kind of professional man who has a good reputation and a steady practice, and is on pleasant terms with his neighbours and his colleagues and his club. They have a cook, a parlour maid, and a woman who comes 3 days a week to help with the laundry. Charlotte has 2 children, a daughter away at school, 13 and serious-minded, and a son who is 8 and still at home with a governess. She is, by every measure her era has to offer, a thoroughly respectable woman. Her hair is dressed correctly. Her collar is immaculate. She reads the same newspapers her husband reads, takes walks in the correct parks, calls on the correct people on the correct days. She gives to charity, she attends church, she's polite to tradespeople but not overly familiar with them, and in approximately 2 hours she's going to slip a small silver card holder, not hers, never purchased, into the lining of her muff and walk calmly out of a department store on Oxford Street. This will not be the first time. Stay with me, because the story of why Charlotte does this, and what happens when she's eventually caught, and how the world around her responds is one of the stranger, more quietly revealing stories the Victorian era has to offer. It touches something real, about boredom and constraint and the peculiar weight of a life that has everything in it except room to breathe. It touches something real about class, about medicine, about the way powerful people protect other powerful people and dress that protection up as compassion. And it is, in its own strange and human way, a story about what it means to be a woman in a world that has very carefully decided what women are allowed to want. But let us not rush ahead. Let us stay with Charlotte for a while first, and let us understand what her days actually look like, because that context, the texture of her ordinary life, is where the whole thing begins to make sense. Charlotte's mornings begin at 7:30. She does not rise before that. This is one of the things that distinguishes her household from the households of women who must work, from the households where she would be the cook or the parlour maid rather than the woman they work for. By the time Charlotte comes downstairs, the fire's already lit, the breakfast things are already laid, the kitchen has already been in motion for 2 hours, the cook arrived before 6, the range stoked and heated, the bread made or bought from the baker's boy who comes round each morning. Charlotte simply appears, dressed and composed, and the house receives her as though it has been waiting. Her dressing has taken, this morning as every morning, the better part of an hour and a half. This is not vanity. This is simply the mechanics of being a properly dressed woman of her class in 1892. The chemise first, white cotton, fresh each morning. Then the combinations, the all-in-one undergarment that has become fashionable in recent years, replacing the separate drawers and chemise of an earlier generation. Then the corset, which her parlour-maid laces from the back with practised efficiency, pulling the strings to the tension Charlotte prefers for an ordinary day at home. Not the dramatic tightening reserved for evening, but the firm, supportive hold that creates the line her dress is cut to require. The camisole over the corset, the petticoat, her dress, which buttons up the back with 14 small covered buttons, each one requiring the maid's fingers and a degree of patience. The collar, detachable, starched to a smooth evenness that Charlotte's own neck would never achieve. The cuffs, matching. A small brooch at the throat. Her boots, with their 12 side buttons, fastened with a hook. Her hair, which the maid has arranged over a small frame of false hair to create the appropriate fullness at the back, secured with 23 pins whose individual locations she has more or less memorized. By the time she descends the stairs, she is a construction, a beautiful, expensive, precisely assembled construction, and the construction must be maintained for the next 12 hours or so, through the confer with the cook and the morning correspondence and the walk in the park if the weather permits, and the calls and the shopping and the return home and the change for afternoon and then the change for dinner, each transition requiring assistance, each state of dress a performance of appropriate status. Breakfast is a ritual she takes seriously. Toast and butter, a soft-boiled egg, a cup of tea that is neither too strong nor too weak. Her cook has learned over years exactly how Charlotte prefers it, and this silent mastery of her preference, maintained without discussion, is one of the small dignities of a well-run household. Her husband reads the paper. Charlotte reads her correspondence. There is generally not much of it, which she does not acknowledge as a disappointment even to herself. A note from her friend Agnes about Thursday's arrangements. A reminder from the dressmaker about a fitting for the winter coat, which must be ready before December. Nothing that requires what you might call genuine, sustained thought. Her husband finishes his toast, folds his paper, and departs for his office at 20 minutes to 9. She hears the front door close. The house settles. And here is the thing about Charlotte's life that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who has not inhabited it, who has not lived inside the comfortable, carpeted, well-heated, entirely correct stillness of a prosperous Victorian household on a Tuesday morning in October with nothing wrong and nothing especially right. The silence that follows her husband's departure is not peaceful exactly, or it is peaceful, technically. Everything is peaceful. The fire burns. The maid moves quietly in the next room. For women like Charlotte, the department store was the most reliably available form of freedom on offer. The arrival of plate glass, large sheets of it, increasingly affordable as the century progressed, had changed everything about how goods were displayed to the passing public. Before plate glass, shop windows were small and divided by wooden glazing bars, the goods behind them glimpsed rather than properly seen. With plate glass, the entire facade of a shop could become a single unified display, a stage, a silent advertisement for the world of abundance waiting just inside the door. Stores competed fiercely on the quality of their window displays, hiring dedicated staff to arrange and rearrange them sometimes weekly or even daily, constructing small theatrical scenes of merchandise that suggested not just products but ways of living. Inside, electric lighting, coming into general use in the better shops by the late 1880s, did something to merchandise that gaslight had not quite managed. It picked out the colours in silk so that the blue was truly blue and the gold was truly gold rather than the slightly flattened versions that candlelight or gaslight produced. It made glass sparkle. It eliminated the shadows in the corners and beneath the counters that gaslight always produced. One contemporary observer described the effect as an atmosphere of perpetual afternoon, and that is exactly right. The department store was always lit at the same comfortable intensity, regardless of the weather outside or the hour of the day. You entered a space suspended from ordinary time, from the grey October light or the November fog pressing against the windows, and you were surrounded by beauty and warmth and things. The abundance itself was part of the experience. The sheer quantity and variety of objects on display was part of what the department store sold. A Victorian household of moderate means was not a spare place. Victorians were not known for their minimalism, and Charlotte's house had more ornaments and pictures and pieces of furniture and decorative objects than most modern rooms would contain. But the department store made even the most well-furnished home feel edited, curated, limited. At Marshall and Snellgrove on Oxford Street, you might find 40 different patterns of dress fabric in one section alone, ranged in bolts of varying heights, the colours moving from one end of the spectrum to the other in a display that was itself a kind of art. At Harrods, by the early 1890s, you could purchase gloves in 27 colours. That number is specific because it was recorded proudly in their advertising materials, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment. About the richness of the world that commerce could provide. And here is what I find genuinely interesting about those 27 colours. The department store addressed itself specifically, explicitly, and commercially to women. Not to households, not to families, to women. the advertising language, the display strategies, the architecture of the store itself, the tea rooms, the reading rooms, the comfortable rest areas with their upholstered chairs, all the elements that made the store a destination rather than simply a shop, had all been designed to attract women and to keep them there. Women were the primary customers, women were the audience being courted, and women, as a result, developed an unprecedented and culturally legitimate reason to leave their homes, travel to a commercial district and spend several hours in public without any particular social obligation attached to the visit. Shopping for a prosperous Victorian woman was not just an errand, it was an activity, a socially sanctioned form of public life that had not existed in the same way for the generation before. The irony, and it is a genuine one, not manufactured for effect, is that this space of relative freedom also became the space where the particular pressures of those women's lives expressed themselves most visibly and most dramatically. The shops gave women somewhere to go, and in those shops some women took things, not because they needed them. Because is the whole story, and we will arrive there. Let us walk with Charlotte for a moment. Let us follow her through the door of a shop, a large establishment on Oxford Street, one of the newer ones with plate glass windows and electric lighting and the particular smell of new fabric and floor polish, and a faint note of something floral from the perfume counter near the entrance. She comes in from the cold, the October air still on her coat, and her cheeks slightly pink from the walk. She pauses just inside the door for a moment, the way one does when stepping from outside air into warmth, letting oneself arrive. The floor stretches ahead of her. Glass cases run along both sides, lit from within, holding gloves and small leather goods and ribbons and the little silver and enamel accessories that Victorian women accumulated, the hair combs and card cases, and small frames and button hooks and vinaigrettes, and all the paraphernalia of a properly organized feminine life. Bolts of fabric are stacked at the back against a wall lined with shelving, arranged by colour, deep wine reds and forest greens, and a pale blue that is almost grey, and several shades of black for morning wear, which Victorian women required at the ready more often than one might wish. A salesgirl behind the nearest counter looks up and offers a practised smile, the professional smile of someone who has been doing this for several years and has learned to mean it just enough to serve its purpose without exhausting herself on it. Charlotte begins to browse. She picks up a pair of gloves. Pale kid examines the stitching, sets them down. She looks at a small beaded evening bag, turns it in her hands. She pauses at a display of card cases, dark tortoiseshell, brown leather, one in silver plate with an engraved pattern of flowers around the edges. She picks up a card case in dark tortoiseshell with a silver monogram in the corner. Not her monogram, but one of those generic decorative ones that reads like something aristocratic without committing to any specific family. The weight of it in her palm is precise and satisfying. It is small enough to disappear in a closed fist. She does not need a card case. She has a perfectly adequate card case at home, purchased 3 years ago from this very store. She puts it in her muff, and then she continues browsing, and her face does not change, and her posture does not change, and she moves with the ordinary unhurried drift of a woman with an afternoon to fill, and she arrives at the glove counter and asks to see something in a pale grey kid, and the salesgirl goes to fetch it from the drawer behind the counter, and Charlotte stands there at the glass, with the stolen card case in her muff, perfectly and entirely calm. Here is where it becomes genuinely strange, where it stops being a simple story about theft and becomes something considerably harder to categorize. Charlotte is not poor. She is not stealing because she needs the card case or because she cannot afford it. The card case cost perhaps 3 shillings and sixpence, not nothing in 1892, but easily within the household budget of a solicitor's wife. She could have paid for it without strain. She could have bought 3 of them and wrapped them as Christmas gifts for Agnes and her sister and the vicar's wife, and not particularly noticed the expenditure. She did not want the card case exactly. not in the way one wants something one has been saving for, something specific and longed for that fills a particular gap. She wanted something, and the wanting and the taking and the walking out with the thing hidden against her body produced, for a few minutes, a sensation that was the precise opposite of the comfortable, carpeted, well-heated emptiness of her Tuesday morning. She felt awake. Now, this is not a simple story about boredom, and I want to be careful about that. The temptation is to flatten it, to say that Victorian women stole from shops because their lives were dull, and leave it at that, as though the explanation is sufficient. It is not. It misses the parts of the story that are actually the most interesting. The shoplifting phenomenon that swept through the middle and upper classes of England and America in the last 2 decades of the 19th century was real, and it was documented, and it was startling enough to the people living through it that they spent considerable energy trying to understand it. Why were respectable women stealing? Not poor women, not working women with obvious material need. Respectable women, women with servants and households and husbands in the professions, women who could afford what they were taking. Between 1880 and the turn of the century, losses to shoplifting by female customers increased significantly enough that stores began hiring special female detectives, they called them store detectives, or female shop walkers, specifically to monitor the behavior of well-dressed women. Think about that for a moment. The stores that were building their entire commercial identity around welcoming respectable women, around being a safe and pleasant space for exactly that demographic, found themselves in the position of having to quietly police those same women for theft. It was a problem without a comfortable solution, because here is where the class dimension enters, and it does not leave. If a poor woman, a working woman, a woman from the streets around Seven Dials or Whitechapel or Bethnal Green, if she was caught taking something from a shop, the response was generally straightforward. She was handed to the police. She appeared before a magistrate. She received a sentence. The machinery of the law moved in its accustomed direction without particular hesitation or sentiment. If a woman in good clothes, with a good address, married to a professional man, if she was caught with unpurchased merchandise in her muff or tucked into the folds of her skirt, something quite different could happen if the right people were involved. She might be escorted discreetly to a back office and spoken to quietly and sent home with a warning. She might be released after her husband arrived, composed and mortified, to collect her and make suitable assurances. She might be referred to a physician. She might be diagnosed. For England, the contrast was as clear as it was uncomfortable. The middle-class woman was a kleptomaniac. The working-class woman was simply a thief. The diagnosis existed for one class of woman and not the other, and that was not an accident of medical observation. It was a choice, made in courtrooms and consulting rooms and department store back offices across 2 continents, over several decades, about who deserved protection from their own behavior. The word kleptomania had existed since the 1840s. It appeared in French medical literature around 1840, combining the Greek words for theft and madness, but it gained its real cultural traction, its practical utility as a legal defense, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Precisely the period when women of the middle and upper classes were being observed shoplifting at rates that could not be ignored. The definition that circulated in legal and medical circles was notably specific on one point. To qualify as kleptomania, the theft must not be motivated by economic need. The explicit absence of need was built into the diagnosis from the beginning, which meant, by construction, that only people who could afford what they were taking were eligible for the protection it offered. The medical framework that grew up around the diagnosis was, by and large, genuinely believed by the physicians who articulated it. This is important to understand. It would be too easy to imagine a conspiracy of wealthy men cynically inventing a diagnosis to protect wealthy women. The reality is more interesting and, I think, more troubling, because the people who built the kleptomania framework mostly believed what they were saying. Those diagnosed with kleptomania in the late 19th century were almost entirely female and almost entirely of the middle class. The diagnosis emerged in large part from the medical belief of the time that mental instability in women was intimately connected to reproductive function. The language used in the medical journals of the period is extraordinary in its confidence and its wrongness. Disorders of menstruation were frequently cited as a cause of what was called moral insanity, a category that covered everything from irritability to theft to what one physician delicately described as an unbecoming preoccupation with excitement. Ovarian insanity was a recognized term in respectable medical circles as late as the 1890s. A woman's mind in the Victorian medical framework was understood to be uniquely susceptible to disruption by her body, specifically by the demands of her reproductive system, which placed, the theory held, enormous strain on the nervous system, particularly during menstruation, pregnancy, and the change of life. Under this strain, a woman of otherwise good character might be temporarily deprived of full moral agency. She might do things she would not ordinarily do. She might, for example, take something that did not belong to her without fully understanding or intending what she was doing. The shop in this framework was practically a trap. The abundance of desirable objects, the warm enclosed atmosphere, the stimulation of light and colour and novelty, it was almost more than the delicate female nervous system could be expected to manage without occasionally, regrettably, going slightly wrong. Now, I want to pause here, because there is something both infuriating and genuinely sad about this picture, and I want to name both things properly. The infuriating part is obvious enough. The idea that women lacked full moral agency because of their reproductive systems was used against women constantly throughout the Victorian era, to deny them the vote, to exclude them from professional life, to justify their subordination in marriage and in law. The kleptomania diagnosis was another variation on the same theme. It protected these women from criminal conviction, yes, but the protection it offered required them to accept a version of themselves as fundamentally unaccountable, as creatures whose behavior could not fully be their own, who were at the mercy of their biology in ways that made them unsuitable for full legal responsibility. The sad part, which is less often discussed, is that some of the women who received this diagnosis may have found it genuinely clarifying, not because it was accurate, but because it gave language to something that was real, even if it described that real thing completely wrong. Charlotte did not know why she took things. She had tried to understand it in herself and found the understanding slippery. She was not a dishonest person in her general life. She did not cheat at cards or deceive her husband about money or take more than her share at the supper table. She was in her ordinary life quite scrupulous about such things. And yet, the shops, the particular quality of attention that came over her when she was in a shop, a sharpness and a fullness of sensation that her regular days did not provide. She had not told anyone about it. Of course she had not. There was no vocabulary for it that would not have sounded either mad or criminal, and she was confident she was neither, or so she believed, until the afternoon in the spring of 1893 when the female shopwalker at the establishment on Oxford Street put her hand on Charlotte's arm and said, quietly, if she would please come with her. The back office of a department store in the 1890s was not a comfortable room. It was functional in the way of rooms designed for one purpose only: a desk, a chair or two on either side of it, filing cabinets of a somewhat utilitarian character, a single window that looked onto a light well and provided a column of greyish light but no view worth mentioning. The shopwalker, her name was Mrs. Briggs. She had been doing this particular job for 4 years, and she had seen most things, sat Charlotte down opposite her at the desk and placed the contents of Charlotte's muff carefully on the surface between them: the small silver card holder, a pair of gloves, pale grey kid, that had been in Charlotte's possession for 3 weeks without having been purchased, a tortoiseshell hair comb with small paste diamonds set along its spine. Charlotte sat looking at these objects and felt, underneath the cold flood of fear that was moving through her, something she could not entirely account for, something almost like relief. Mrs. Briggs had seen that particular expression before, more than once. She had seen it often enough that she no longer found it surprising. The store had several options at this juncture. They could contact the police, in which case Charlotte would appear before a magistrate, and her name would be in the newspapers, and her husband would have to stand in a courtroom in a way that could seriously damage his professional standing, and the children would eventually learn of it, because children always did, somehow. Or they could contact Charlotte's husband directly, mortifying but contained, or, and this was becoming an increasingly standard option as the decade wore on, they could refer the matter to a physician of Charlotte's acquaintance, or their own recommendation, and the physician could make a determination, and the matter could be handled quietly, and Charlotte's name would go on a private list of women to be watched closely on future visits. Charlotte's husband was contacted. He arrived at the store within the hour, pale-faced and composed in the way that men of his profession learn to be composed under any circumstances, regardless of what they were actually feeling. He thanked Mrs. Briggs and the store manager for their discretion. He was apologetic and dignified, and clearly shaken in the controlled, almost imperceptible way that very proper Victorian men showed their shaking. He took Charlotte home. They did not speak much in the cab. Charlotte looked out the window at the streets passing. The afternoon had turned wet, the gas lamps were being lit even though it was only 3:30, and the city looked amber and slightly unreal through the rain-beaded glass. She was waiting to feel something definitive, shame perhaps, some large, settling, conclusive emotion that would mark this as a turning point. She felt instead very tired, and somewhere underneath the tiredness, still present, still warm, the faint residue of that morning's sensation in the shop, the sharpness, the specific temporary aliveness of it. Her husband arranged for her to see a physician the following week. The physician, a kind man genuinely, with spectacles and a large walnut desk and a row of serious books arranged behind him in the way that physicians arranged their books in those days, to communicate both learning and order, listened to Charlotte's account with evident interest. He asked about her menstrual cycle, about the quality of her sleep, about her appetite. He asked whether she found herself prone to excitement or irritability at particular times of the month. He used the word nerves several times in ways that were not quite medically precise, but communicated a general sympathy and an established framework for understanding what she was describing. He told her she was suffering from a form of nervous disorder not uncommon in women of her constitution and her circumstances, that it had a name, kleptomania. He said it carefully, as though handing her something fragile, and that with proper rest and reduced exposure to stimulating environments and perhaps some mild tonic, it was quite manageable. Charlotte sat in the chair across from him and turned the word over in her mind. Kleptomania, a medical term, a Greek-rooted, polysyllabic, entirely respectable medical term. Not thief, not criminal, not a woman who takes things from shops because something in her daily life creates a need that her daily life does not otherwise meet. A diagnosis. And a diagnosis, whatever its inadequacies, is at least something. A shape, an explanation, a word you can give the thing so the thing stops just floating there unnamed. She did not steal again for 6 months. And then she did. But let us leave Charlotte for now. She will return to us, the story is not finished with her, and take a longer view of the world she is moving through. The last 2 decades of the 19th century in England produced what social historians have occasionally called the golden age of the department store, though that phrase undersells how genuinely strange and new the experience was for the people living through it. The great stores of London were transforming retail into something it had never quite been before. They were not simply places to purchase goods, they were theatrical environments. They were spectacles. You walked through their front doors and entered a version of the world in which every surface had been curated and every object had been considered, and nothing ugly or ordinary or wearing had been permitted through the service entrance. The shopping experience itself had changed significantly from what had come before. In the older style of retail shop, the kind that had served Victoria's subjects earlier in the century, a customer came in with a purpose. She asked for what she needed. She waited while it was fetched from wherever it was kept. She examined it, negotiated the price or accepted the marked one, paid for it and left. The transaction was the point. There was no wandering, no browsing in the unhurried sense, no lingering to see what else might catch the eye. The goods were behind counters or in drawers or on high shelves, and you described what you wanted and someone found it for you. The department store disrupted this entirely. It created something genuinely new in retail. The open floor, the invitation to wander, merchandise arranged not behind barriers but at hand, available to be picked up and held and examined at leisure, and set down and moved past. The customer was not a petitioner waiting for service to be extended. She was a visitor, moving through a world of objects, deciding for herself what interested her, taking her time, following her own attention wherever it led. This was, in a word, revolutionary, and I do not use that word lightly. The management of one's own time and attention in a public space, without social obligation attached to the presence, this was not something respectable Victorian women had much experience of. The department store offered it every weekday and Saturday morning, inside Charlotte's favourite store on Oxford Street, not the one where she was caught, a different one she had shopped at for years without incident. The morning light comes in from the street windows and from the electric lights overhead, and the floors are wood-polished to a warm gleam, and the counters run in long parallel lines with their glass tops and their contents arranged just so. The fabric department smells of new cloth, a clean, slightly dusty smell that is specific to the fibres of it, different textures having subtly different versions of it, the heavier smell of wool and the lighter, almost sweet smell of silk, and the clean cottony plainness of calico and muslin. The haberdashery counter smells of something almost medicinal, from the dyes perhaps, mixed with the waxy quality of ribbon spools. The glove counter smells of leather. Charlotte knows this store the way she knows her own house. She knows which aisles lead where, which counters carry what, which salesgirl in the lace department is more knowledgeable than the one beside her, which particular section at the back of the second floor usually has things that have been reduced and that no one has bothered to move to the sales section yet. She has been coming here for 7 years. She shops here for necessities, and she shops here for pleasure, and she shops here when she has no particular reason to shop at all, which is quite often, because the shops are reliably more interesting than the morning room. Now let us think carefully about what happened in the late Victorian era with kleptomania as a legal matter, because it is one of the stranger chapters in the relationship between medicine and the courts, and it illuminates the class dynamics at the heart of this story more clearly than almost anything else could. When a working-class woman was caught shoplifting, and they were caught too, regularly, because working-class women also stole from shops, for reasons that were often considerably more straightforward, the legal process was generally swift and unsentimental. She was charged under the Larceny Act. She appeared before a magistrate. She received a sentence appropriate to her offence, a fine she could not always pay, which would then convert to a prison sentence, or a sentence directly. She might be discharged with a warning if the amount was very small and the magistrate was in a charitable mood. But the machinery of the law treated her as a rational agent who had made a choice, and it held her accountable for that choice. When a middle-class woman was caught, the process was rarely that clean. The stores were often reluctant to prosecute. This was not purely altruism. A prosecution meant publicity. A prosecution meant the store's name appeared in the newspapers alongside the word theft and the description of a well-dressed woman being escorted from the premises. And the stores had spent considerable money and considerable effort constructing themselves as pleasant, safe, unimpeachably respectable establishments. Scandal was bad for business in a very direct way. Absorbing the loss was frequently the better commercial decision, particularly for a store that built its reputation on its quality of customer. But when prosecutions did occur, when the matter reached a court rather than being resolved quietly in a back office, the kleptomania defense, whether or not that exact word was used, began appearing with increasing frequency in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. A physician would testify. He would speak about the defendant's nervous constitution, about the strains placed upon the female system, about the temporary suspension of moral agency that could occur in women of sensitive temperament under conditions of physiological disturbance. The jury, all male, since women could not serve on juries in England until 1920, would listen to this testimony and look at the defendant, a well-dressed woman of evident respectability sitting in the dock, and make their determination. Acquittals were not uncommon. Neither were sentences of discharge or findings of guilty accompanied by absolute non-custodial outcomes that amounted to the same thing in practical terms. The medical framework did what it was constructed to do. It provided a route out of criminal culpability that was not available in practice to women who did not have the social capital to command a physician's testimony and a court's sympathy. There were magistrates who were openly skeptical of the kleptomania defense, and said so from the bench, in terms that make for interesting reading now. One magistrate in London in 1895 wrote in his notes, preserved in the court archive, something to the effect that it was a remarkable coincidence that this particular nervous disorder appeared to afflict exclusively women of property, and seemed entirely absent among the women from Seven Dials who appeared before him for similar offences. He was not wrong. He had noticed the right thing, but his observation did not change the outcome for the women before him. There is a letter published in a radical women's paper in 1896. The author's full name has been lost. It was published under initials only, in which the writer makes the observation about this discrepancy with a directness that is startling for the period. She writes, paraphrased, "If a woman in silk gloves takes a ribbon and is found to be ill, and a woman in cotton gloves takes the same ribbon and is found to be a thief, one must conclude that the illness resides somewhere in the gloves." That line has stayed with me since I first read it. It is precise and dry and exactly right. Now let us look carefully at some specific cases, because the individual stories are always where the history lives most vividly, and there are several that are instructive in different ways. There was the case of a woman in Edinburgh, a minister's wife, noted specifically in the contemporary account as a woman of irreproachable character and deep religious conviction, who had been removing small items from the millinery department of a shop in Princes Street for the better part of a year before she was caught. The items she took were mostly ribbons and small decorative trimmings, feathers, bits of velvet, things used to trim hats, entirely useless without a hat to trim, and mostly in colours she could not have easily incorporated into anything she owned. She had a drawer full of them in her dressing room. The case was referred to a physician who testified on the question of nervous exhaustion and the unusual demands placed upon the wife of a man in a spiritually demanding vocation. She was not prosecuted. She returned to her work with the church and her household and her Sunday teas, and what she did with the drawer full of ribbons after the incident is not recorded. There was a case in New York. Kleptomania was as much an American phenomenon as an English one, with Macy's and Lord & Taylor and Wanamaker's in Philadelphia generating their own quiet epidemic of respectable theft alongside the English department stores. A society woman, well documented not in the newspapers of the time, since the newspapers had been persuaded not to report it, but in the private correspondence of several parties involved. She was caught 3 times at 3 different stores in the course of a single year. Each time she was found to have taken small things: a silk handkerchief, a length of ribbon, a small china figurine from the stationery and gift counter. The 3rd time, she was sent to a sanatorium in upstate New York that specialized in nervous disorders in women of good family. She stayed for several weeks. She returned to New York looking rested and resumed her social life. She was not caught again, though whether this was because she stopped or because she became more careful is a question the record does not answer. There was a case in London that is sadder, and I want to be careful with it. A woman of genuine means, a widow of some property, widowed young with children who were grown by the time of the incident, whose household was managed by servants who did not particularly need managing, who wrote in a letter to her daughter that was preserved by circumstance, about having really nothing in the world that requires my sustained attention. She was caught shoplifting from Harrods in 1888. A small thing, a button hook with a silver handle, the kind of trivial luxury that Harrods sold by the dozen. She was referred to a physician. She was diagnosed. She continued. She was caught twice more in the following decade, at different stores. Each time the diagnosis protected her from prosecution. Each time she was sent home to the household that ran without her, to the days that did not require her sustained attention. I think about that widow with her button hook. I think about what it means to take things you do not need, to risk things that genuinely matter, for the sake of a sensation that lasts a few minutes. not wickedness, something lonelier than wickedness. And here is something I want to say carefully about the internal experience of the women involved, because the medical literature of the period, whatever its inadequacies as an explanation, does contain, if you read it against the grain, some glimpses of what it actually felt like to be in these women's positions. The physician who treated Louise, I am using a different name here, documented his consultations with unusual care. Louise had been referred to him in the early 1890s, following the discovery that she had been shoplifting from several London stores over a period of approximately 18 months. He noted in his first consultation that she was in excellent physical health, her menstrual cycle regular, her nervous constitution appearing quite sound. She showed no signs of the debility typically associated with the condition. She was, the physician wrote, remarkably calm. When he asked her about the thefts, she spoke about them in terms that were more reflective than defensive. She told him, according to his notes, that she had no particular attachment to the objects themselves. She had not used most of them. Some she had given away, claiming to have purchased them. Others were simply in her dressing room. She took them, she said, because the taking was the thing, not the having. And then she said something else that the physician recorded without appearing to know what to do with it. She said that the 15 minutes after she had taken something were the only 15 minutes of any given day when she felt, as she put it, like someone. Like someone. I read that phrase and I feel its weight, even across 130 years. The physician prescribed rest and removal from stimulating environments and a tonic containing iron and phosphorus, and he recorded the case in terms consistent with the standard diagnostic framework of female nervous susceptibility. He was doing what he knew how to do, within the limits of what he had been trained to know. But Louise had said something true. The question is what it was true about. Now I want to spend some time in Charlotte's particular world. Not the dramatic moments, but the ordinary daily texture of it, because I think the details of a Victorian upper-class woman's day are both more interesting than people often assume, and more illuminating of this story than the dramatic scenes. Charlotte's house is on a street that is respectable without being fashionable, which is its own very precise category in the Victorian social geography of London. Fashionable required more money and more performance, more entertaining, more calling, more visible participation in the network of dinners and evening parties and country house weekends that constituted the upper reaches of social life. Respectable without fashionable was a quieter register, comfortable, orderly, not aspirational in ways that required constant visible effort, but also not so settled that the social obligations had entirely relaxed. The house has 5 bedrooms, a drawing room, a dining room, a morning room at the back where Charlotte spends most of her daylight hours, a kitchen and scullery below stairs, a butler's pantry, a wine cellar, and the servants' rooms in the attic. It is lit by gas, which is considered modern and convenient compared to the oil lamps and candles of an earlier generation, though the gas gives the upper rooms a warm yellowish cast that is pleasant in the evenings and slightly dim for reading in the afternoons. The house smells, Charlotte has attended to this, of beeswax and the faint clean sweetness of lavender sachets placed in the linens and the wardrobes. Underneath these managed scents, and particularly in the lower floors, there is also coal fire, which is not unpleasant, and kitchen, which is also not unpleasant, and the background presence of a house occupied by people, the accumulation of warmth and breath and fabric and wood. The morning room is Charlotte's real domain. The drawing room is for guests and formal occasions. The dining room is for meals. But the morning room, which looks out over the garden and catches the morning light reasonably well given that the garden faces northeast, is where Charlotte actually lives during the day. It contains her writing desk, placed to get the best of the window, a small upright piano she plays with competence but without particular passion, working through the pieces she has known for years, some Mendelssohn, a little Schubert, a few popular drawing-room songs she learnt as a girl and has never quite managed to forget, her sewing table with its embroidery project, a bookcase of modest dimensions holding a mixture of novels and household management volumes, and a set of natural history books that belonged to her father, a small sofa and 2 armchairs arranged near the fireplace, and the fire itself, which the housemaid lights each morning before Charlotte comes downstairs, and which burns steadily through the day with periodic attention to the coal scuttle. Charlotte's mornings, after breakfast and the cook's conference and the post, tend to settle into something like this: an hour at the writing desk dealing with correspondence, which on most days does not require a full hour, but which she approaches with thoroughness, because thoroughness has become habitual. A half hour perhaps at the embroidery, which she finds genuinely meditative in a way the piano does not quite provide. The embroidery requires a repetitive physical attention that quiets the parts of her mind that otherwise do not quiet easily. Some reading, a walk, if the weather permits, either alone through the nearby streets or in the park if she feels like a longer excursion. And then often the shops. The shops are the most interesting part of the day, not the household management, which she handles with competence but without particular engagement, not the correspondence, which is pleasant but not absorbing, not even the reading, which is enjoyable but solitary in a way that sometimes emphasizes rather than relieves the solitude of the morning. The shops are where she feels most like herself, or rather, most like whatever version of herself exists beyond the role of wife and mother and hostess and responsible member of the household. In the shops she is simply a woman among other women, looking at things, choosing or not choosing, spending money or not spending it, anonymous in the pleasant way that being one of a crowd is anonymous. She knows this about herself. She has reflected on it. She finds it both comprehensible and slightly embarrassing that the best part of her day is usually the shops. But here is what she does not fully understand about herself, what the physician did not understand and perhaps could not have understood with the tools available to him. The sensation she experiences in the shops is not simply pleasure in the merchandise. It is something more like the sensation of being fully present, of inhabiting herself completely rather than performing her own existence from a slight distance, which is how most of the rest of her day feels to her without her ever quite acknowledging it in those terms. The department store, with its warmth and light and abundance, does something to her attention. Her attention quickens in a way it does not quicken in the morning room or the drawing room or the dining room or any of the other rooms of her life. She notices things. She feels the weight of objects in her hands. She makes small rapid judgments. Yes, that shade of blue is right. No, that pattern is too busy. Yes, the stitching on that glove is particularly good. And these judgments, small as they are, feel real in a way that the larger but less specific decisions of her household life do not always feel real. She is, in these moments, someone who does things, who acts, who decides. And when she takes something, when that particular decision is made in the quick, specific, irreversible way it is made, the sensation of acting, of deciding, of being a person whose choices have consequences, is at its most intense. The physician called this an expression of nervous excitement secondary to ovarian disturbance. I call it a person reaching for something her ordinary life does not provide. Both of these descriptions are true. Neither is the whole truth. Now let us talk about what the stores did in response to all of this, because the store's response is one of the more practically interesting parts of the story, and it tells us something about how commercial institutions manage problems they have, in a sense, partly created for themselves. The department stores of the late Victorian era were not passive victims of the shoplifting phenomenon. They were commercial enterprises with considerable intelligence and adaptability, and they responded to the problem in several directions at once. The first response was architectural. The original layout of many Victorian department stores had been relatively open, with merchandise displayed in ways that made it accessible to customers for handling and examination. Bolts of fabric that could be unrolled and draped, small objects set out on flat counters at arm's reach, gloves arranged in open trays. As the shoplifting problem became undeniable, the architecture began to shift. Glass display cases became more common and more central to the store's design. Counters were reconfigured to keep merchandise at a slightly greater distance from the browsing customer's natural grasp. Items that were small and easily concealed were moved to positions where a salesgirl had a clear line of sight at all times. The second response was human. The female store detective, the plainclothes employee whose specific job was to watch women while appearing not to watch them, became a standard feature of the large department store by the 1880s. This was a peculiar professional position, both practically and socially. A female store detective was a working woman, earning a wage, employed by the store, but her job required her to pass as something else entirely, as a customer, as a woman with no particular purpose, simply browsing alongside the women she was surveilling. She had to move through the same space as her targets without ever betraying her role. She had to notice things without appearing to notice them. Her targets were typically women who looked like her, or rather like what she was pretending to look like. Respectable women, well-dressed women, women who had the means to purchase what they were in the process of taking. The female store detective and the female shoplifter existed in a strange mirror relationship, both women out of their expected context, both performing a kind of social invisibility, both moving through the warm, bright space of the department store with a purpose that was not the obvious one. There is an account published in a late Victorian periodical on the subject of store security, in which a female store detective describes her method. She paid particular attention, she said, to women who returned, not women who browsed in the ordinary leisured way, moving from counter to counter with the fluid unhurriedness of someone with an afternoon to fill. That was perfectly normal. That was the point of the store. She watched for women who came back to the same item, who picked something up and set it down and moved away and came back to it, who seemed to be conducting an internal conversation about something, which showed in a slight tension around the eyes, a particular quality of stillness, the breath held just slightly. She also watched hands. The hand that hesitated above a counter and then moved in a particular way. The fold of fabric at a skirt seam that was slightly fuller than it had been 5 minutes before. The almost imperceptible change in a woman's posture after a certain moment. Something settling. Something concluded. She said she almost never had to watch for very long. The third response was the charge account. This had implications far beyond theft prevention, and I want to spend a moment with it because it illuminates the larger situation particularly well. The department store charge account, which became widespread in the 1880s and 90s, was a system by which a regular customer could purchase goods without paying immediately. The store maintained an account in her name. She shopped and signed. At the end of the month, a bill was sent to the household, typically to her husband since he managed the finances. He paid it. This was presented as a convenience, and in a purely practical sense it was, but it was also, from the store's perspective, a documentation system. A woman with a charge account was a woman whose purchases were on record and traceable. A woman paying in cash was anonymous. A woman signing for her purchase was identified. And critically, and this is the point, a woman whose monthly statement went to her husband was a woman whose shopping was ultimately legible to someone else. Charlotte's husband had arranged, after the incident with Mrs. Briggs, that any purchases his wife made were to be charged to the household account at 3 approved stores whose monthly bills came to his office. It was presented to Charlotte as a convenience. She understood what it meant. She did not protest it, because protesting would have required explaining why she preferred to pay in cash, and that explanation would have arrived somewhere she did not want to go. She accepted the arrangement and found it, in its own way, clarifying. It removed one option. The question of what remained, what the shops could still give her under these new conditions, settled into the background of her days. Present but not requiring immediate resolution. For a while, here is something that tends to get skipped in historical accounts of Victorian kleptomania, and I think it is worth dwelling on. The lives of the women who stood behind the counters. The salesgirls and counter assistants of the Victorian department store were themselves a new category of working woman, and their situation was precarious in ways that are instructive to examine alongside the situations of their customers. The department store created, for the first time, large-scale respectable employment for lower middle-class women, not working-class women in the strictest sense. The stores deliberately cultivated the perception that their staff were educated, presentable young women of good character, which was part of their appeal to the respectable female customers they were trying to attract, but women who needed to earn their living, which placed them in a very different category from Charlotte. These women stood for 9 or 10 hours a day. They wore uniforms, a dark dress, neat and identical. They addressed customers as madam. They showed patience with customers who handled merchandise for extended periods and bought nothing, which was most of what Charlotte represented on most of her visits. They were not permitted to sit in most stores until the introduction of legislation in 1886 that required employers to provide seating for shop assistants when they were not required to stand. This was considered progressive. Their wages were modest. Many of them lived in dormitory accommodation provided by the larger stores, where the conditions were regulated and surveilled in a paternalistic way that claimed to offer safety and respectability while maintaining a level of control over their private lives that was, by any later standard, remarkable. Early curfews, restrictions on male visitors, rules about the wearing of dress outside working hours, a system that presented itself as protective and functioned as comprehensive oversight, and it was these women, standing in their dark uniforms, tired, watchful, extending exactly the right amount of deference to every customer regardless of how the customer treated them, who watched the Charlottes of the world taking things and had to decide what they saw and what to do about it. A salesgirl who reported a middle-class woman for shoplifting did not necessarily benefit from that report. If the woman's husband arrived and the matter was handled quietly and the woman was sent home, the salesgirl had created an unpleasant scene and would be watched carefully by her supervisor for signs of similar overreach in future. If the matter escalated to police involvement, she would be called as a witness and would have to face the well-dressed family across a courtroom, knowing that her credibility against theirs was limited. If the woman in question turned out to be a relation or acquaintance of the store's proprietor or a significant regular customer, the consequences for the salesgirl could be more severe than the consequences for the woman she had reported. The female store detectives had somewhat more institutional backing. Their job was explicitly to watch and report, but even they operated within a system that had decided, at some level above their authority, how these cases were to be handled, and handling them quietly was almost always the preferred outcome. They were employed to notice. They were not always employed to act on what they noticed. The whole apparatus depended, at every level, on the willingness of everyone involved to pretend that certain things were not what they were. The salesgirls pretended they had not seen, or that what they saw was ambiguous. The store managers resolved matters discreetly rather than legally. The physicians provided frameworks. The courts made exceptions. And the women like Charlotte continued to live in their morning rooms with their embroidery and their correspondence, and their locked cabinets with their gloves and their ribbons and their painted rattles. Let us return to Charlotte's particular life, because I want to walk through a full day with her, not the incident at the shop, but an ordinary day, a day that did not involve taking anything, because most of her days did not involve taking anything, and those days are the context in which the ones that did must be understood. It is a Thursday in March, several months after the incident and the physician's visit. Charlotte has been following the physician's advice with reasonable fidelity. She has reduced her visits to the shops, substituting walks in the park and more frequent calls on Agnes and other friends. She has been taking the tonic, which she finds neither helpful nor harmful, simply a metallic sweetness she swallows each morning with a glass of water. She has been resting more deliberately in the afternoons, which is to say she has been lying down in her room for 45 minutes after luncheon, whether or not she feels the need for it, because the physician mentioned rest and she is genuinely trying. She wakes at 7:30 to find the room already brightened by the late winter morning light coming through the curtains, which her parlour maid has already drawn back on her quiet early rounds. The fire in her bedroom has been lit. The water in the washing basin on the stand is fresh and cold. She washes her face and hands, the cold water against her skin pulling her properly into wakefulness. She rings for the maid. The dressing routine proceeds as it always does, each layer in its proper order, each button fastened, the corset laced to the daytime tension, the hair dressed and pinned. Charlotte looks at herself in the dressing glass as the maid adjusts the final pin and finds herself thinking, as she sometimes does at this moment, about the curious relationship between the self she sees there and the self that is doing the looking. The woman in the glass is composed and correct. The woman doing the looking has a great deal of unregulated internal weather that the woman in the glass betrays nothing of. She descends to breakfast. Her husband is already at the table, behind the paper, and they exchange the comfortable abbreviated good mornings of people who have been saying good morning to each other across this particular table for 12 years. He has a parliamentary debate on his mind. There is something happening in the house about legal reform. He mentions it briefly. She listens and asks a question, and they talk about it for a few minutes, with the genuine mutual interest of two people who read the same papers and have been discussing the same issues for a long time. This is one of the things Charlotte values in her marriage. Her husband discusses things with her. Not all husbands did in her circle. After breakfast, the household conference. Charlotte and the cook stand in the kitchen doorway and go through the week's requirements. Thursday means the roast needs to be ordered for the weekend, and they are expecting Charlotte's mother for Sunday luncheon, which requires the extra care of producing dishes her mother approves of, without either repeating last time's menu exactly, or introducing anything so unfamiliar as to cause comment. The cook, who has been in the household for 6 years and knows Charlotte's mother nearly as well as Charlotte does, makes a few suggestions. They settle on a plan. Charlotte makes a note, then letters. There are 3 to write this morning. One to her mother confirming Sunday's arrangements and the timing of her arrival, and asking about the journey, because her mother is beginning to find the journey increasingly demanding, and Charlotte wants to acknowledge this without making the acknowledgement so prominent that it sounds like concern, which her mother finds condescending. One to her daughter at school, the regular Thursday letter, which Charlotte writes with more care than any other correspondence because it is difficult to write to a daughter who is 13 and inhabiting a very different world from the one Charlotte inhabited at 13, more informed, more aware of the wider sphere, with teachers who discuss things that Charlotte's teachers did not discuss, and still sound like someone her daughter wants to hear from. And one to the physician, confirming next week's appointment. She writes all 3. The letter to her mother takes 3 drafts to get the tone right. The letter to her daughter comes more easily. The letter to the physician takes less than 2 minutes. By this point it is 11 in the morning. She has been at her desk for an hour and 10 minutes. The morning room is warm. The fire has settled into that deep, steady heat it develops by mid-morning. Outside the window, the garden in its late winter state is showing the first tentative signs of change. Some new growth along the herbaceous border, a pale green quite different from the grey-brown of last month's remnants. The light is good today, pale and clean and without the flat greyness of last week. Charlotte picks up her embroidery. The tablecloth is past the halfway point now, the border on the long side almost done, the repeating ivy pattern moving reliably from one end toward the other. She works for 20 minutes in the way that is most natural to embroidery, which is to let the hands do the work while the mind drifts in whatever direction it chooses. Today the mind drifts toward Sunday and her mother, and then toward her daughter and what her daughter's world looks like, which she finds both interesting and slightly disorienting since she cannot fully imagine it from the inside, and then, without particularly intending it, toward the shops, not in the way it sometimes does, not with the particular quality of attention that precedes a visit with an intent she has been trying to manage, simply toward the shops as a place, the warmth of them, the specific quality of being in a large, beautiful room filled with things chosen for their beauty or their usefulness, surrounded by other women doing the same thing she is doing, the comfortable anonymity of it. She misses it in the reduced form she has been practicing for the last few months. She misses it the way you miss a walk you used to take every day and have stopped taking. The mild, persistent absence of something that was part of your daily rhythm. She sets the embroidery down and looks out at the garden. She thinks, Agnes. She can call on Agnes this afternoon. Agnes lives not far away and is almost always at home on Thursdays and is one of the people whose company Charlotte genuinely enjoys rather than merely tolerates, which is a real distinction in a social world where considerable time is spent in the company of people with whom one has nothing in particular in common, except an approximate equivalence of social position. Agnes is funny in a dry, quiet way. Agnes is interested in things. Agnes reads seriously and has opinions about what she reads and enjoys the conversation that follows from having opinions. They have been friends for 15 years, since the same music lessons taken the same term in the same teacher's studio in Marylebone, and the friendship has, through the various changes and removals that life produces, maintained itself with the relative ease of something well-founded. Charlotte writes a note to Agnes, informal, the kind you send in the morning for an afternoon call, perfectly acceptable between well-established friends. The parlour maid takes it round. Agnes sends back a note by return. Yes, come at 3. Charlotte has her luncheon alone, as she often does on days when her husband is at the office. Soup, some cold meat, bread, a glass of water. She reads during luncheon, the novel that has been in progress for 3 weeks, and today she actually reads more than 20 minutes of it, which feels like progress. The story is set in the country, in a large house in the manner that Victorian novelists favoured, and the main character is a woman making a decision about her life that Charlotte finds she thinks about longer than the writing strictly requires. After luncheon, the 45 minutes of rest that the physician recommended, she lies on the chaise longue in her room, not sleeping, but horizontal and quiet, which is its own category of useful. The house is quiet around her. Below stairs there are the sounds of the kitchen at its midday work. Somewhere above, the governess is overseeing her son's afternoon lessons. The afternoon light in her room is pleasant, coming through the cream-coloured curtains in that warm, muted way that filtered light has in a well-furnished room. She does not steal anything today. She dresses again after the rest period. Not the elaborate dressing of the morning, but the intermediate change that marks the transition from morning occupation to afternoon calls, a slightly more formal arrangement of the dress and the accessories to indicate that she is presenting herself to someone. She puts on her hat. She buttons her gloves. She walks the 10 minutes to Agnes's house. Agnes is in her drawing room, which overlooks a small square with a plane tree in the centre, and the afternoon tea is already laid. They talk for 2 hours. About Agnes's eldest daughter, who is doing something at a women's institute that interests Agnes greatly, and that Agnes's husband is lukewarm about. About the novel Charlotte has been reading. Agnes has read it already, characteristically, and they discuss the main character's decision and what it means, and whether they think it was the right choice, and whether it was possible for a woman in those circumstances to have made any other choice. About an article Agnes has read about women in America who are beginning to practice law, which seems extraordinary to both of them, or rather extraordinary in a way that is exciting rather than disturbing, which is a specific kind of extraordinary. Charlotte walks home in the late afternoon, the light starting to go, the air colder. She walks through streets she knows as well as she knows her own house, past the familiar facades and the familiar corner with the news vendor, and the familiar smell of the bakery on the main road, that fills the afternoon air with something warm and wheaty and pleasant. She thinks about the novel's main character, and the decision. She thinks about the article Agnes mentioned, the women practicing law in America. She arrives home to find her son at the foot of the stairs waiting for her in the way that 8-year-olds wait when they have something they cannot wait to tell. He has been doing something with a piece of wire and a small magnet that the governess has given him, and which produced an effect he found both alarming and delightful, and which he requires someone to share immediately. Charlotte sits on the stairs with her coat still on, and listens to the explanation of the wire and the magnet with genuine interest, because she finds that being interested is not difficult when the person explaining is her son, and the thing he is explaining is the discovery of something unexpected. Dinner at 7, her husband home by 6. The evening in the drawing room after. The fire and the lamp and the embroidery and the newspaper. Her husband has something more to say about the parliamentary debate. Charlotte asks about it. They talk. The clock on the mantelpiece marks the half hours. Outside, the March evening is cold and clear. By 9, Charlotte's husband has turned to his papers and Charlotte is working through the ivy border by the good lamplight. She can see when she holds the work up that the left side of the long border will need perhaps 2 more evenings to complete. Then the short sides, then the centre. She estimates another 4 or 5 months. She finds herself thinking again about the woman in the novel, about the decision. About the conversation with Agnes, she is not unhappy. She wants to be clear about that to herself, because the difference matters. She is not unhappy. She has a good husband and a good house and a good life, and children she loves, and a friend like Agnes, and a dozen other things that constitute genuine good fortune. She knows this and she is grateful for it, but sometimes, at 9 in the evening when the drawing room is warm and the fire is good and her husband is in his papers, and the ivy border is moving forward by small increments toward its completion, she feels the full weight of what she is, and it is more, and also less than all of those good things. It is the whole particular shape of a particular human life, with its satisfactions and its limitations and its unspoken questions. It is the woman in the novel making her decision. It is the women in America practicing law. It is Louise in the physician's consulting room saying like someone. She continues the embroidery. The thread moves through the cloth in small, precise stitches. The house settles around her for the night. Now, there is something more I want to tell you about the larger context in which Charlotte's story sits, because the Victorian era's approach to women's psychology did not stand still, and the changes that happened toward the end of the century are part of the full picture. By the 1890s, the intellectual landscape around women's mental life was beginning, slowly, to shift. Not dramatically, not in ways that immediately changed the lives of women like Charlotte, but the questions were beginning to change. The questions that would eventually produce a different set of answers. John Stuart Mill had published his essay on the subjection of women in 1869, and while it was not universally welcomed, to put it mildly, it had entered the conversation in a way that made certain observations harder to avoid. He had written about what happened to intelligence when it was given no legitimate outlet, about the waste of capable minds constrained to purposes that did not require their full capacity. His language was measured and his argument was careful, and he was nonetheless describing something that many of the women who read him found to be an accurate description of their experience. Florence Nightingale had written, in the early 1850s, a personal essay called Cassandra that was not published in her lifetime in full but circulated in manuscript. It is one of the more extraordinary things written in the Victorian period, and I would recommend it to anyone who has not read it, because it is luminously angry and also luminously precise about what it felt like from the inside to be an intelligent woman in a world that had decided what intelligent women should do with themselves. She writes about sitting in drawing rooms while the hours pass. She writes about the exhausting performance of cheerfulness in circumstances that do not naturally produce it. She writes about the particular quality of intellectual starvation that looks, from the outside, like a very comfortable life. She was not writing about kleptomania, but she was writing about the same thing. By the late 1890s, a generation after Mill and Nightingale, the women's movement in England had taken on enough organisation and visibility that the question of women's lives had become genuinely public in a way it had not been before. The suffrage movement was growing. The new woman, that cultural construction, that figure of the bicycling, higher education-seeking, professionally ambitious woman who appeared in the novels and magazines of the decade, was being debated, not universally celebrated, but debated, which is a kind of cultural recognition. Within medicine, the psychoanalytic movement was beginning to offer an alternative to the biological determinism of the older psychiatric tradition. Freud published his Studies on Hysteria in 1895. The early psychoanalytic thinking proposed that the symptoms of women like Charlotte, the stealing, the nervous episodes, the behaviors that did not fit the standard somatic explanations, might be expressions of unconscious conflict rather than purely biological dysfunction. The explanation was different. It was in some ways more interesting. It was also, in its own way, still locating the problem inside the individual woman rather than in the conditions of her life. The question of what conditions produce which behaviors in which people would take considerably longer to answer with any adequacy. It would take in some ways the better part of the 20th century, with all its disruptions and reorganizations of what women's lives could contain, before the relationship between constraint and symptom became fully visible in the way that makes what happened in the Victorian department stores make complete sense. But Charlotte was not waiting for the 20th century. Charlotte was in 1896 in her morning room, with her embroidery and her correspondence and her careful adherence to the physician's recommendations and her gradually returning interest in the shops. She went to the shops on a Tuesday in October, which is where we began. She went carefully and with genuine intention not to take anything. She spent an hour in the warmth and brightness and abundance of her favourite store on Oxford Street, and she looked at things, and she felt the familiar quickening of her attention, and she spoke with one of the salesgirls about some new fabric that had come in, a deep green wool that she thought might work well for a winter jacket, and she touched the fabric and considered the price, and ultimately decided against it. She bought a pair of gloves instead, pale grey kid, and had them charged to the account. She walked home with the gloves in their tissue paper in a bag, and the October afternoon was cold and bright, and she felt, if not the sharp, particular aliveness of before, then at least the moderate satisfaction of having spent a morning usefully and pleasantly and without incident. She went home and changed for the afternoon and called on Agnes and had her 2 hours of genuine conversation, and walked home again in the early dark, and sat at dinner with her husband, and talked about the parliamentary situation, and worked on the embroidery until 9:30 and went to bed. This was most of her life, most of the time. The ordinary days, the days that did not involve locked cabinets or back offices or physician's notes or charges under the Larceny Act, the days that were simply what they were, comfortable and constrained and genuinely her own, in the limited way that the era permitted things to be genuinely one's own. I find myself, when I think about Charlotte and about all the women whose stories are folded into hers, arriving at something that is not quite a conclusion and not quite a resolution, more like a recognition. The Victorian era built a world for its women that was, in many of its visible dimensions, quite good, better than the world that had existed before it in a number of specific ways: greater domestic comfort, greater access to education for the daughters of the middle class, greater visibility in cultural life, the beginning of certain legal rights that had not previously existed, and simultaneously a world that was deeply, comprehensively organized around the assumption that women did not require the things that full human agency requires, did not require scope, did not require consequence, did not require the experience of doing something that mattered, and knowing it mattered, and being held responsible for whether it went well or badly. The department store gave them a small commercial version of scope, a small bounded, carefully managed arena in which desire was acknowledged and choice was exercised and attention was genuinely engaged. It was not enough. It was not close to enough, but it was what was available, and people make use of what is available, and some of those people, in their particular and human ways, made use of it in ways that went further than the shops intended. The locked cabinet, 9 pairs of gloves, 11 handkerchiefs, 1 child's rattle, painted red and blue, the 15 minutes of feeling like someone. She did not want the card case, exactly. Not in the way one wants something one is saving for, something specific and longed for. She wanted something, and the wanting and the taking and the walking out with the thing hidden against her body produced, for a few minutes, a sensation that was the precise opposite of the comfortable, carpeted, well-heated emptiness of her Tuesday morning. She felt awake. Now, this is not a simple story about boredom. I want to be careful here, because the temptation is to make it simple, to say that Victorian women stole from shops because their lives were boring, and leave it at that. But that flattens something that was considerably more complicated, and it misses the parts of the story that I think are genuinely worth sitting with: the shoplifting epidemic. And that is what contemporaries called it, an epidemic, with all the alarm and befuddlement that word implies, that swept through the middle and upper classes of England and America in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, was real, and it was documented, and it was startling enough to the people living through it that they spent considerable energy trying to understand it. Why were respectable women stealing? Not poor women, not working women who had obvious material need. Respectable women, women with servants and households and husbands in the professions, women who could afford what they were taking. Between 1880 and the turn of the century, department store losses to shoplifting by female customers increased significantly enough that stores began hiring special female detectives. They called them store detectives or female shop walkers, specifically to monitor the behavior of well-dressed women. Think about that for a moment. The stores that were building their entire commercial identity around welcoming respectable women, around being a safe and pleasant space for exactly that demographic, found themselves in the position of having to quietly police those same women for theft. It was a problem without a comfortable solution, because here is where the class dimension enters, and it does not leave. If a poor woman, a working woman, a woman from the streets around Seven Dials or Whitechapel or the Gorbals in Glasgow, if she was caught taking something from a shop, the response was straightforward. She was handed to the police, she appeared before a magistrate, she received a sentence appropriate to her offence. The machinery of the law moved in its accustomed direction without particular hesitation or sentiment. If a woman in good clothes, with a good address, married to a professional man, if she was caught with unpurchased merchandise in her muff or tucked into her skirts, something quite different happened, or at least something quite different could happen if the right people intervened in the right ways. She might be escorted discreetly to a back office and spoken to quietly and sent home with a warning and the merchandise returned. She might be released without charge after her husband was contacted, after her husband arrived, composed and mortified, to collect her and make suitable assurances. She might be referred to a physician. She might be diagnosed. For England, the contrast was clear. The middle-class woman was a kleptomaniac. The working-class woman was simply a thief. The diagnosis existed for one class of woman and not the other, and that was not an accident of medical observation. It was a choice, made in courtrooms and consulting rooms and department store back offices across 2 continents, about who deserved protection from their own behavior. The word kleptomania had existed since the 1840s. It appeared in French medical literature around 1840, combining the Greek words for theft and madness, but it gained its real currency, its cultural traction, its practical utility as a legal defense in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Precisely the period when women of the middle and upper classes were being observed shoplifting at a rate that could not be ignored. The medical framework that grew up around the diagnosis was genuinely believed by many of the physicians who articulated it. This is important. It would be too easy to imagine a conspiracy of wealthy men cynically inventing a diagnosis to protect wealthy women. The reality is more interesting and I think more troubling, because the people who built the kleptomania framework mostly believed what they were saying. Those diagnosed with kleptomania in the late 19th century were almost always female and almost always middle class. The diagnosis emerged, in large part, from the medical belief of the time that mental instability in women was connected to reproductive function. The language used in the medical journals of the period is extraordinary in its confidence and its specificity and its wrongness. Disorders of menstruation were frequently cited as a cause of what was called moral insanity, a category that covered everything from irritability to theft to what one physician delicately described as an unbecoming preoccupation with excitement. Ovarian insanity, as some doctors genuinely termed it, was considered a recognized condition in respectable medical circles as late as the 1890s. The argument went something like this: a woman's mind, in the Victorian medical framework, was understood to be uniquely susceptible to disruption by her body, specifically by the demands of her reproductive system, which, the theory held, placed enormous strain on the nervous system, particularly during menstruation, pregnancy, and the change of life. Under this strain, a woman of otherwise good character might be temporarily deprived of full moral agency. She might do things she would not ordinarily do. She might, for example, take something that did not belong to her without fully understanding or intending what she was doing. The shop in this framework was practically a trap. The abundance of desirable objects, the warm enclosed atmosphere, the stimulation, it was almost too much for the delicate female nervous system to manage without occasionally, regrettably, going slightly wrong. Now, I want to pause here, because there is something both infuriating and genuinely sad about this picture. The infuriating part is obvious. The idea that women lacked full moral agency because of their reproductive systems was used against women constantly throughout the Victorian era to deny them the vote, to exclude them from professional life, to justify their subordination in marriage and law. The kleptomania diagnosis was another variation on the same theme. It protected these women from criminal conviction, yes, but the protection it offered required them to accept a version of themselves as fundamentally unaccountable, as creatures whose behavior could not be fully their own. The sad part, which is less often discussed, is that some of the women who received this diagnosis may have found it genuinely clarifying. Not because it was accurate, but because it gave language to something that was real, even if it described that real thing completely wrong. Charlotte did not know why she took things. She had tried to understand it in herself, and had found the understanding slippery. She was not a dishonest person. She did not cheat at cards or deceive her husband about money, or take more than her share of the sweets at afternoon tea. She was, in her ordinary life, quite scrupulous. And yet, the shops, the particular quality of attention that descended on her when she was in a shop, a sharpness and a fullness of sensation that her regular days did not provide. She had not told anyone about it. Of course she had not. There was no vocabulary for it that would not have sounded either mad or criminal, and she was neither, or so she believed. Until the afternoon in the spring of 1893, when the female shopwalker at the establishment on Oxford Street put her hand on Charlotte's arm and said, quietly, if she would please come with her. The back office of a department store in the 1890s was not a comfortable place. It was functional. A desk, a chair or two, filing cabinets, a single window onto a light well. The shopwalker, her name was Mrs. Briggs, and she had been doing this job for 4 years and had seen most things, sat Charlotte down and placed the contents of her muff on the desk between them. The small silver card holder, a pair of gloves, kid pale grey, that had been in Charlotte's possession for 3 weeks without having been purchased, a tortoiseshell hair comb with small paste diamonds along the spine. Charlotte sat looking at these items and felt, underneath the cold flood of fear, something she could not entirely account for, something almost like relief. Mrs. Briggs had seen that look before too. The store had a choice at this point. They could contact the police, in which case Charlotte would appear before a magistrate and her name would be in the newspapers, and her husband would have to stand there in public in a way that could seriously damage his professional standing, and the children would eventually know, somehow, children always did. Or they could contact Charlotte's husband directly, which would be mortifying but contained. Or, and this was becoming an increasingly common option as the decade wore on, they could refer the matter to a physician of Charlotte's acquaintance, or their own recommendation, and the physician could make a determination, and the matter could be handled quietly, and the store would add Charlotte's name to a private list of women to be watched, and would absorb the loss as the cost of avoiding a scandal that would not be good for anyone. Charlotte's husband was contacted. He arrived within the hour, pale-faced and composed in the way that men of his profession learn to be composed under any circumstances, regardless of what they are actually feeling. He thanked Mrs. Briggs and the store manager. He was apologetic and dignified and clearly shaken. He took Charlotte home. They did not speak much in the cab. Charlotte looked out the window at the streets passing. The afternoon had turned wet. The gas lamps were beginning to be lit even though it was only 3:30, and the city looked amber and slightly unreal through the rain-beaded glass. She was waiting to feel something definitive. Shame, perhaps. Something large and settling that would mark this as a turning point. She felt instead very tired, and somewhere beneath the tiredness, still warm, the faint residue of that morning's sensation in the shop, the sharpness, the aliveness. Her husband arranged for her to see a physician the following week. The physician, a kind man genuinely, with spectacles and a large walnut desk and a row of serious books behind him, listened to Charlotte's account with evident interest. He asked about her menstrual cycle, about sleep, about appetite. He asked whether she felt herself prone to excitement or irritability at particular times of the month. He used the word nerves several times in ways that were not quite precise but communicated a general sympathy. He told her she was suffering from a form of nervous disorder not uncommon in women of her constitution and her circumstances, that it had a name, kleptomania, he said it carefully, as though handing her something fragile, and that with proper rest and reduced stimulation and perhaps some mild tonic, it was quite manageable. Charlotte sat in the chair across from him and heard the word and turned it over. Kleptomania, a medical term, a Greek-rooted, polysyllabic, entirely respectable medical term. It was not thief. It was not criminal. It was not woman who takes things from shops because she is bored. It was a diagnosis. And a diagnosis, whatever its inadequacies, is at least something, a shape, an explanation, a word you can give the thing so the thing stops just floating there unnamed. She did not steal again for 6 months. And then she did. But let us leave Charlotte for now. She will return, and take a longer view of the world she is moving through, because the individual story only makes complete sense against the background of the larger one. And the larger one is extraordinary. The last 2 decades of the 19th century in England produced what social historians have occasionally described as the golden age of the department store, though that phrase undersells how genuinely strange and new the experience was. The great stores of London, Harrods, Whiteley's, Liberty's, Marshall and Snellgrove, Peter Robinson, were transforming retail into something it had never quite been before. They were not simply places to purchase goods, they were theatrical environments, spectacle. The arrival of plate glass, large sheets of it, increasingly affordable as the century progressed, changed everything about how goods were displayed. Before plate glass, shop windows were small and divided, the goods behind them glimpsed rather than seen. With plate glass, the entire facade of a shop could become a display, a stage, a silent advertisement for the world of abundance inside. Stores competed fiercely on the quality of their window displays, hiring dedicated staff to arrange and rearrange them, sometimes changing them weekly or even daily, to create the impression of constant novelty. Inside, electric lighting, coming into use in the better shops by the late 1880s, did something to merchandise that gaslight had not done in quite the same way. It picked out the colours in silk, it made glass sparkle, it created what one contemporary observer called an atmosphere of perpetual afternoon, because the department store was always lit at the same intensity regardless of the weather outside or the hour of the day. You entered a space that was suspended from ordinary time, from the grey October light or the November fog, and you were surrounded by beauty and brightness and warmth and things. The abundance itself was part of the experience, the sheer quantity of objects. A Victorian household of moderate means was not a spare place. Victorians were not known for minimalism, but the department store made even the most well-furnished home feel edited. At Marshall and Snellgrove, you might find 40 different patterns of dress fabric in one section alone. At Harrods, by the early 1890s, you could purchase gloves in 27 colours. The number is specific because it was recorded proudly in their advertising materials. And here is the thing that I find genuinely interesting about those 27 colours of gloves, about all of it. The department store addressed itself specifically, explicitly, and commercially to women, not to households, not to families, to women. The advertising language, the display strategies, the architecture of the store itself, the tea rooms and reading rooms and rest areas that made the store a destination rather than simply a shop, all of it was designed to attract women and to keep them there. Women were the primary customers. Women were the audience being courted, and women, as a result, developed an unprecedented and culturally legitimate reason to leave their homes, travel to a commercial district, and spend several hours in public without any particular social requirement attached to the visit. Shopping for a prosperous Victorian woman was not just an errand, it was an activity, a socially sanctioned form of public life that had not existed in the same way a generation earlier. The irony, and it is a genuine one, not manufactured for effect, is that this space of relative freedom also became the space where the particular pressure of those women's lives expressed itself most visibly and most dramatically. The shops gave women somewhere to go, and in those shops, some women took things, not because they needed them, because is the whole story. There is a document. I came across it in the notes of a researcher who had been working through old court records from the 1890s, a document that is in its small way One of the more extraordinary things I have read in connection with this period. It is a list of items recovered from the home of a woman who had been caught shoplifting from a department store in Liverpool in 1894. The items were found in a locked cabinet in her bedroom after the store manager had alerted her husband, and the husband, in a state of some agitation, had searched the house. The list runs to 2 pages in the original document. It includes 9 pairs of gloves, 4 card cases, none of them monogrammed for her, 7 assorted ribbons, 3 small picture frames, silver-plated, 2 fans, 1 small enamel bonbonniere, a sweet box, a little decorative thing with a painted lid, 11 handkerchiefs, various hair combs and pins, a small bottle of violet toilet water, unopened, and at the very bottom of the list, added almost as an afterthought, 1 child's wooden rattle, painted red and blue. She had been shoplifting for at least 3 years. The things she took were mostly small and mostly beautiful, and almost entirely useless. The kind of objects that sit in locked cabinets and are looked at in private, and mean something that is difficult to articulate to anyone who has not felt the particular weight of a life that is full and empty at the same time. The child's rattle. I keep coming back to the child's rattle. She had children. The document mentions a son and a daughter, but the rattle is small and painted and almost certainly taken from a toy counter on an impulse that does not entirely make logical sense. I am not going to explain the rattle. I just think you should know it was there. Now, let us talk about what the law actually did with all of this, because the legal history of kleptomania in the Victorian era is one of the stranger chapters in the relationship between medicine and the courts, and it illuminates the class dynamics at the heart of this story more clearly than almost anything else. When a working-class woman was caught shoplifting, and they were caught too, regularly, because working-class women also stole from shops, for reasons that were often considerably more straightforward, the legal process was generally swift. She was charged under the Larceny Act. She appeared before a magistrate. She might receive a fine she could not pay, which would then convert to a prison sentence. She might receive a sentence directly. She might, if she had children and the magistrate was in a forgiving mood and the amount was small, be discharged with a warning. But the machinery of the law treated her as a rational agent who had made a choice, and it held her accountable for that choice. When a middle-class woman was caught, the process was rarely that clean. The stores themselves were often reluctant to prosecute. This was not purely altruism. A prosecution meant publicity. A prosecution meant the name of the store appeared in the newspapers alongside the word theft and the description of a woman in respectable clothes being taken into custody. And the stores had spent considerable money and effort constructing themselves as pleasant, safe, entirely above-board establishments. A scandal was bad for business. Absorbing the loss was frequently calculated to be the better commercial decision. But when prosecutions did occur, when the matter reached a court, the kleptomania defense, whether or not that exact word was used, began to appear with increasing frequency in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. A physician would testify. He would speak about the defendant's nervous constitution, about the strains placed upon the female system, about the temporary suspension of moral agency that could occur in women of sensitive temperament under conditions of excitement or physiological disturbance. The jury, all male obviously, women could not serve on juries in England until 1920, would listen. The defendant would sit in the dock looking exactly like what she was. A well-dressed woman of evident respectability who had made a very embarrassing mistake and would certainly not do it again. Acquittals were not uncommon. Neither were sentences of discharge, or findings of guilty accompanied by absolute non-custodial disposals that amounted to the same thing. The medical framework did what it was built to do. It provided a route out of criminal culpability that was not available, in practice, to women who did not have the social capital to command a physician's testimony and a court's sympathy. The number of women benefiting from this kind of outcome increased significantly enough, between 1880 and 1900, that the kleptomania diagnosis became something of a recognized feature of the legal landscape. Solicitors in practice were aware of it. Physicians who testified in such cases developed a standard vocabulary for their testimony. The machinery for protecting respectable women from the consequences of their theft became, over 2 decades, relatively well oiled, which is not to say there was no pushback. There were magistrates who were openly skeptical of the kleptomania defense and said so from the bench, in terms that make for interesting reading now. There were medical professionals who questioned the diagnosis, not always for the right reasons, but the questions were asked, and there were observers, a few of them women themselves, who noted the spectacular class bias of a system in which the same behavior produced radically different outcomes depending on the social position of the person who committed it. There is a letter published in a radical women's paper in 1896. I have been unable to recover the author's name, it was published under initials, in which the writer makes the observation with a directness that is rather startling for the period. She writes, roughly paraphrased since the original is not mine to reproduce directly, if a woman in silk gloves takes a ribbon and is found to be ill, and a woman in cotton gloves takes the same ribbon and is found to be a thief, one must conclude that the illness is located somewhere in the gloves. That line has stayed with me. It is precise and dry and exactly right, but I want to stay in Charlotte's story a little longer, because the law is one part of the picture and the daily life of a woman like her is another, and the daily life is the part that most interests me. The law tells us what the era decided about kleptomania. The daily life tells us why it happened. Charlotte's days, in the months after the incident at the shop on Oxford Street, changed somewhat. Her husband had spoken to her. He had been, in the manner of Victorian professional men discussing difficult things with their wives, simultaneously concerned and oblique. He had used the word nerves, as the physician had. He had suggested rest. He had looked at her, at certain moments, with an expression she found difficult to interpret, something between worry and a kind of helpless incomprehension, as though she were a piece of machinery that had done something unexpected, and he was not entirely sure which part needed adjusting. She rested. She reduced her excursions to the shops. She took mild tonic, iron-based, that tasted faintly of something metallic and sweet. She did her embroidery in the evenings and called on Agnes on Thursdays and supervised the governess and met with the cook and answered her correspondence, which remained largely the same in volume and content as it had always been. The emptiness did not go anywhere. That is the thing about comfortable Victorian women's emptiness. It did not require particular circumstances to maintain itself. It simply was. It was the condition of the life, not a symptom of any specific failure. She thought sometimes in the evenings when her husband was reading and the house was settled and quiet, about the physician's word, kleptomania. She thought about what it meant that there was a word for it, that other women had done this too, that it had become common enough to name. She found this in some oblique way faintly comforting, not because the diagnosis explained her to herself. She did not quite believe the explanation. The menstrual instability, the nervous constitution, the overwhelmed delicate female system. She was not particularly delicate. She knew that about herself, but the word meant she was not unique. And not being unique is a form of company, even when you cannot speak to anyone about it. Let us talk about the other women, because Charlotte's story, particular as it is, was not hers alone. The same story, or versions of it, played out across 2 countries and 3 decades, and the women who lived it came from a range of circumstances that tells us something about what the department store and the era were producing. There was the case of a woman in Edinburgh, a minister's wife, noted specifically in the contemporary account as a woman of irreproachable character and deep religious conviction, who had been systematically removing small items from the millinery department of a shop in Princes Street for the better part of a year before she was caught. The items she took were mostly ribbons and small decorative trimmings, feathers, bits of velvet, things used to trim hats, entirely useless without a hat to trim. She had a cabinet full of them. The case was referred to a physician who testified on the question of nervous exhaustion and the unusual demands placed upon the wife of a man in a demanding spiritual vocation. She was not prosecuted. There was a case in New York. Kleptomania was as much an American phenomenon as an English one, with Macy's and Lord & Taylor and Wanamaker's in Philadelphia generating their own quiet epidemic of respectable theft A society woman, well documented, not in the newspapers at the time. The newspapers were persuaded not to report it, but in the private correspondence of several parties involved. She was caught 3 times at 3 different stores in the course of a single year. The third time, she was sent to a sanatorium in upstate New York for a period of several weeks. The sanatorium specialized in nervous disorders in women of good family. She returned to New York looking rested, resumed her social life, and was not caught again, though whether this was because she stopped or because she became more careful is a question the record does not answer. There was a case in London that is sadder, and I want to be careful with it. A woman of genuine means, a widow of some property, who had been widowed young and whose children were grown and whose household was managed by servants who did not particularly need managing, and who had, as she wrote in a letter to her daughter that was preserved by accident, really nothing in the world that requires my sustained attention. She was caught shoplifting from Harrods in 1888. A small thing, a button hook with a silver handle, the kind of trivial luxury that Harrods sold by the dozen. She was referred to a physician. She was diagnosed. She continued. She was caught twice more in the following decade, at different stores. Each time the diagnosis protected her from prosecution. Each time she was sent home to the household that ran without her. I think about her, that widow with the button hook. I think about what it means to take things that you do not need, to risk things that genuinely matter, for the sake of a sensation that lasts a few minutes. Not wickedness. Something lonelier than wickedness. Now, I promised you I would tell you what the stores did in response, and I should, because the store's response is one of the more practically interesting parts of the story. The department stores of the late Victorian era were not passive victims of the shoplifting epidemic. They were commercial enterprises with considerable intelligence and adaptability, and they responded to the problem in several ways simultaneously. The first response was architectural. The original layout of many Victorian department stores had been relatively open, with merchandise displayed in ways that made it accessible to customers for handling. Bolts of fabric that could be touched and unrolled, small objects set out on counters at arm's reach. As the shoplifting problem became undeniable, the architecture began to change. Glass display cases became more common. Counters were redesigned to keep merchandise slightly further from the customer's natural reach. Items that were easily pocketed were moved to positions where a salesgirl had a clear line of sight. The second response was surveillance. The store detective, the female shopwalker, the plainclothes employee whose job was specifically to watch women while appearing not to watch them, became a standard feature of the large department store by the 1880s. This was a peculiar position, both professionally and socially. A female store detective was a working woman earning a wage employed by the store, but her job required her to pass as something else, as a customer, or as a well-dressed woman with no particular purpose, simply browsing. She had to move through the same space as the women she was watching without betraying her role. She had to notice things without appearing to notice them. Her targets were typically women who looked like her, or looked like she was pretending to look. Respectable women, well-dressed women, women who had the means to purchase what they were in the process of taking. The female store detective and the female shoplifter existed in a strange mirror relationship, both women out of their expected context, both performing a particular kind of social invisibility, both moving through the warm, bright space of the department store with a purpose that was not the obvious one. There is an account published in a late Victorian periodical on the subject of store security, of a female store detective describing her method. She would, she explained, pay particular attention to women who lingered, not women who browsed in the ordinary leisured way, moving from counter to counter with the fluid unhurriedness of someone with nowhere specific to go. That was normal, that was the point of the store. She watched for women who returned to the same item, who handled something and set it down and moved away and came back, who seemed to be managing a conversation with themselves about something, the way people do when they are deciding whether to do a thing they are not certain about. She also watched hands. The hand going into a muff, the fold of fabric at a skirt seam that was slightly fuller than it had been 5 minutes ago, the way a woman's posture changed subtly after a particular moment. Something settling, something resolved. She said she almost never had to watch very long. The third response, the most interesting one to my mind, was the invention of the charge account, which had implications far beyond theft prevention. The department store charge account, which became widespread in the 1880s and 90s, was a system by which a regular customer could purchase goods without paying immediately. The store maintained an account in her name. She shopped and signed. At the end of the month, a bill was sent to the household, typically to her husband, since he controlled the finances. He paid it. This was presented as a convenience, and it was, but it was also, from the store's perspective, a surveillance system. A woman with a charge account was a woman whose purchases were documented and traceable. A woman paying in cash was anonymous. A woman signing for her purchase was identified. And critically, a woman whose husband received her monthly statement was a woman whose shopping was ultimately visible to someone else. There is a tension in that system that I find almost poignant. The department store gave women a form of freedom, a place to go, things to want, an audience of other women in the same condition, and then quietly, practically, for reasons that were as much commercial as social, made that freedom legible to the men who held the financial power in the household. It is a neatly Victorian solution to a Victorian problem. Charlotte's husband had arranged, after the incident at the shop, that any purchases she made were to be added to the household account at 3 stores that he approved and that sent their bills to his office. It was not discussed as a restriction. It was presented as a convenience. She would not have to worry about carrying money. She understood what it meant. She did not protest it. Protesting it would have required her to explain why she wanted to continue paying in cash, and that explanation would have led somewhere she did not want to go. She accepted the arrangement and found it, in its own way, clarifying. The charge account removed one option. The question of what remained, what the shops could still give her under these conditions, settled into the background of her days, present but not urgent, for a while. Now I want to talk about something that does not get talked about enough in connection with this story, which is the internal experience of the women involved, not as the physicians understood it, not as the courts processed it, but as those women might have understood it themselves. This is harder ground, because the primary sources are sparse and mediated. Most of what we know comes from court records, medical case notes, and a handful of diary and letter fragments, but there are enough glimpses to suggest something worth examining. The medical literature of the period, as I mentioned, located kleptomania firmly in the body, in the uterus more or less, in the nervous system as disrupted by reproductive function. The women who received the diagnosis were given a framework that was essentially biological determinism applied to criminal behavior. You did not fully choose this. Your body made you susceptible to it. You are not quite entirely responsible. What the medical literature did not ask, because it did not have the vocabulary or the inclination to ask it, was what these women's ordinary days actually felt like, what they were not allowed to do, and what that exclusion cost them. What it meant to be an intelligent, energetic, capable adult woman in 1892 with no profession, no vote, no acknowledged public life, and a household that largely ran without requiring you. There is a passage in the diary of a woman, not one of the women caught shoplifting as far as I know, though one cannot be entirely certain, a Quaker woman living in Bristol in the 1880s, a woman who was by her account happily married and not apparently in distress, who writes this: "I have today done nothing of the slightest consequence. I arranged the flowers, I called on Mrs. H., I practiced the piano for half an hour, I read, and I am aware, writing this, that tomorrow will be the same, and the day after the same, and the year after the same, and there is nothing wrong with any of it, and nothing wrong with me, and still I do not quite know what to do with all of whatever I am." That last line, whatever I am, I do not know what to do with all of whatever I am. I do not think she was unusual in this. I think she was simply more articulate than most about a condition that was very common, the excitement of the department store, and I use excitement in its older sense, the sense of stimulation, of arousal of the senses, of the feeling of being among vivid things, was real. It was one of the very few readily available sources of that stimulation for women of the middle and upper classes. The colours, the warmth, the textures, the novelty, the press of other people also looking and wanting, the sense of being in a place where desire was not only acknowledged but actively cultivated. This was not nothing. For women whose daily lives were organized around the suppression of visible desire of any kind, this was something quite significant. And the taking, the specific act, the moment of decision and action, the concealment, the walk toward the door with the thing pressed against you, was apparently its own category of sensation. There are enough accounts in the medical literature, filtered though they are through the language of nervous disorder, to suggest that the women who did this were describing something real about the experience, a heightening, an aliveness, a sense, however temporary, of being the agent of something rather than the passive surface on which something happened. I am not romanticizing it. It was also genuinely destructive to the women themselves, to the stores that absorbed the losses, to the women of the working class who were tried and sentenced for the same behavior without the benefit of a diagnosis. The class dimension of kleptomania is an injustice and should not be softened, but the human dimension of it, what it was reaching for, what absence it was attempting to fill, that is worth taking seriously. It is a story about people, not just a story about behavior. Charlotte went back to the shops. Not the same one. She was on their list now, and she knew it. But London was a large city with many shops, and she was a respectable-looking woman with a charge account at 3 stores, and a husband who had not locked her in the house. She went to other shops. She browsed, she looked at things. Most days she simply looked, but occasionally, perhaps twice more over the next 2 years, from what can be gathered from the scattered record of her particular case, she did not simply look, and each time there was the sensation, the sharp, specific, temporary aliveness of it, and afterward the object at home in her possession, and the slow fading of the sensation back into the ordinary texture of the days, and the question of whether it was worth it, which she could not quite answer either way. Let us talk for a moment about the women who prosecuted, who were sent to jail, because they are part of this story too, and their part is considerably less comfortable to sit with. A woman named Ellen Parsons, aged 26, described in court records as a charwoman, a cleaning woman, appeared before a magistrate in London in 1889 charged with stealing a length of calico from a draper's shop on the Strand. The calico was found under her dress. She said she had taken it because her children needed something to sleep on and she had no money. The magistrate gave her 3 months. No physician was called. No word with Greek roots was applied to her behavior. She was a woman who had stolen something she needed, and she was sent to prison for it. I am not reporting this to make a simple argument, though the argument is not wrong. I am reporting it because the story of Victorian kleptomania, if it is only told as the story of Charlotte and her muff, and her department store and her physician's diagnosis, is incomplete to the point of being misleading. The architecture that protected Charlotte was built out of the same materials as the architecture that failed Ellen Parsons. You cannot understand one without the other. The historian Elaine Abelson, who has written about this subject with more thoroughness and precision than almost anyone, makes the point that the kleptomania diagnosis was not simply a neutral medical observation applied inconsistently. It was a social technology invented and deployed specifically to handle a situation that the criminal justice system was not equipped to manage, not because the system was incapable of handling women who stole, but because it was incapable of handling the discomfort of prosecuting the wives and daughters of the men who ran it. The diagnosis solved that discomfort. It did not solve anything else. There is one more thing I want to tell you about before I let this story settle into something quieter. It is about what happened to the diagnosis itself, because kleptomania did not remain frozen in the amber of the 1890s. It moved, it changed, it is still with us in a different form, and the changes it underwent are interesting. By the early 20th century, the psychoanalytic movement, Freud and his contemporaries, their students, the whole expanding apparatus of depth psychology, began to offer different explanations for the behavior. The uterine theory gave way to theories of unconscious motivation. Kleptomania was reread as symbolic expression, The things taken were not random, or they were not understood to be random. The act of taking was interpreted as a kind of communication, addressed to someone or something that could not be addressed directly. The child's rattle, the button hook, the 9 pairs of gloves, these were no longer symptoms of reproductive disorder. They were, in the psychoanalytic framework, messages. I find this interesting and somewhat suspicious in equal measure. The psychoanalytic reading is considerably more interesting as a story than the uterine theory, but it still locates the problem inside the individual woman rather than in the conditions of her life. It still asks what is wrong with her rather than what is wrong with the world she is living in. It was not until much later in the 20th century that anyone thought to ask the question from a different angle. Not what pathology produces this behavior, but what social conditions produce this behavior, and in whom and why those people. The answer, when that question was finally asked properly, was not particularly surprising to anyone who had been paying attention to Charlotte. Kleptomania, as it presents clinically in the modern literature, is disproportionately found in women. It is associated with depression, with anxiety, with eating disorders, with a general pattern of conditions that tend to cluster in people who feel, in various specific and treatable and also systemic ways, that they lack control over their own lives. The literature is careful about causation, but the pattern is there. It is there in the clinical studies, and it was there in the back office of the department store on Oxford Street in the spring of 1893, where Charlotte sat looking at the small objects she had taken and felt, underneath everything else, something very close to being understood, not absolved, not excused, something more human than either of those. Seen. Let us come back to her house now. Let us go quietly, the way you go into a room where someone is already settled and you do not want to disturb them. It is evening. October again. This story begins and ends in October, which feels right somehow, that grey-gold season of closing in and drawing close. Charlotte's husband is reading by the lamp. The fire is settled into that steady, unhurried burn that means it has been going for several hours and will go for several more. The children are in bed. The house has the particular quality of sound, or rather of almost no sound, that a well-run Victorian household has in the evening, the domestic machinery at rest, the servants in their own quarters, everything orderly. Charlotte is doing her embroidery. She is working on a tablecloth, a complex piece, a repeating pattern of ivy and small flowers in shades of green and cream and a pale gold. She has been working on it, intermittently, for 3 years. She does not particularly enjoy embroidery. She has a good eye for colour, though, and she finds, when she is doing it, that her mind goes to a certain useful blankness, not peaceful exactly, not unhappy either, a kind of suspension. She looks at the fire for a moment. She listens to the quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticks. Her husband turns a page. Tomorrow there will be the menus. Agnes on Thursday. The governess has mentioned something about the boy's arithmetic. There is a letter to write that she has been putting off for 2 weeks. Not because it is difficult, but because she cannot quite find the right tone for it. She picks up the thread again and continues the pattern. Outside, London is doing what London does. Carriages on the street. The gas lamps lit against the dark. Somewhere not far away a shop is closing for the night. A woman in a black dress is counting the till. A boy is bringing the shutters in from the pavement. The last customers have gone. The bolts of fabric are where they were this morning, and the glass cases hold their contents, and the female shopwalker has gone home to wherever female shopwalkers go. Tomorrow the shops will open again. Charlotte's needle moves through the cloth in small, precise stitches. The fire speaks softly. The house holds its breath. And the evening continues, as evenings do, quietly and without particular resolution, because that is the nature of evenings and of lives and of stories that are really about the spaces between things rather than the things themselves. Let all of that settle now, like the coal fire settling in the grate, like the October evening doing its slow, reliable amber work of closing in. You have been with me through something real tonight, something that is small in some ways and large in others, about a woman in a respectable house in London, about a card case in a muff, about the extraordinary distance between what a life contains and what a life allows, about the way the people who hold power in a society protect each other, and what that protection costs, and what it means for the people it protects and the people it does not, but mostly about the particular stubborn human need to be fully present in one's own life, to be, as Louise said, someone. That need is not a Victorian thing. It is not a woman's thing exclusively. It is not a class thing. It is a human thing, present in the morning room and the department store and the back office and the physician's consulting room and the courtroom and the locked cabinet and the drawer of ribbons and the child's painted rattle. It is present in the drawing room at 9 in the evening by the fire, when the embroidery is in the hands and the thread is moving through the cloth in small, precise stitches, and the clock marks the half hour, and the night outside is dark and cold and entirely quiet. Let that thought move through you and go. Let the drawing room with its fire go quiet. Let the ivy tablecloth in its tissue paper in the linen press rest. Let Charlotte's October evening close in around her gently, the way evenings close in. You are lying down, or nearly. The weight of the day is behind you rather than ahead. The things that seemed urgent this morning are still there but further away now, across a distance that sleep will helpfully increase before morning arrives to close it again. Breathe. The shops are closed. The gas lamps are burning in the streets outside Charlotte's house. Somewhere a bolt is being drawn, a fire being banked, a household settling towards sleep. The October dark is warm and quiet and not requiring anything of anyone. Let the Victorian morning room be still. Let the woman at the embroidery frame set down her needle for the night. Let the locked cabinet be closed, and the question of what is inside it be set aside until another time, or perhaps never. Perhaps the questions that matter most are the ones that stay open. The fire breathes. The clock keeps its patient time. Your breathing is slowing. There is nothing left to manage tonight, just the warmth and the dark and the unhurried company of a story settling around you like weather, like fog, like the particular grey October light that does not demand anything of you and simply is. Let it be. Good night, my friend. Good night, and thank you for spending this evening here. Sleep well, and I will see you next time.